Welcome, everybody. We have another exciting episode of the Free Speech Forward podcast today. This is an episode with, I just learned the correct pronunciation of her name is Wai Wah, and I'm sure we're even going to hear part of her story along with that. This, of course, is the joint partnership project between the Institute for Liberal Values and also 1776 Forward, which is the organization that I co founded with my co host here today, Chris. So I'm about to turn it over to Chris, who will introduce you to Wai Wah, and we'll get started learning all about her story and her perspective on the value of free speech.
Great. Thanks, Joia. And hi, Wai Wah. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing? And thank you, Chris, Joya, JILV, and 1776.
Great. Thank you. Just for everyone out there listening, just a brief background on Wai Wah. Wai Wah Chin is the charter president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, CACAGNY, quite a long acronym, but a good one, which is an all-volunteer organization advocating for equal rights, especially in education. And they, among other things, they pursue a focus on equal rights and advocating for such, including legal action where necessary to protect equality and combat anti-Asian discrimination with a focus on the New York City area. So I'm very excited to hear your story. We usually start Wai Wah with letting you have the floor and tell us how you came to either your project with CACGNY and or being a leader more generally on liberal values and free speech.
First of all, I'll just make that mouthful a little shorter. So we call it CACAGNY for short. So that
That's
makes it a little
better,
fun.
yeah.
Yeah.
I like that
Um,
better. Cacagny.
what we are based in New York. We're based in New York, and we're a local chapter of a, a much larger group that has roots in 1895, actually. And so the our focus is not specifically free speech, but free speech is actually fundamental to any of our other rights. If you cannot express yourself, you cannot speak and voice your opinions, you don't count. You actually have no rights.
Mm.
That goes to all of our rights, our voting rights, our ability to have a different opinion that you want to express and challenge others. You have to be able to do that. You cannot seek truth without being able to express freely. And one of the things that we got involved in first was education in New York. In New York, as in many other places, we have a problem that some people call too many Asians in the top schools. And that is pretty outrageous. And so there was a pressure from a lot of places, the administration, up from the mayor all the way down to your chancellor of the public school system, to try to change the specialized high schools in New York. And the specialized high schools are very, very special, actually. They're admitting students only by one academic objective test. So they don't care about your background of your parents, whether they were wealthy, what professions they had, what you might have done in your extracurriculars, what sort of grades you might have from teachers who may be somewhat subjective. They just look at the outcome of an objective test. Uh, and your race doesn't count, your religion doesn't count. This is what it's all about. And these schools, the top three schools, have generated 15 Nobel Prize winners in STEM. Now, that's really more than what you'd find in a lot of countries.
Mm-hmm.
So the test obviously works, and that, but what was happening is that our voice of saying, "Wait a second, this is wrong," when you try to deny students the opportunity to come in because of their race. And you could couch it any way, you could say it's all sorts of different things, but it really came down to, at the end of the day, that they found that there were too many Asians and were devising ways to get rid of them. And that was happening not just in New York, but it was happening across the country, in San Francisco, in Lowell High School, in Thomas Jefferson on the East Coast, the Boston exam schools. It was happening in many places.
Mm.
And so that's how I and a lot of the other people who are just ordinary people, basically, where a lot of them are first generation immigrants, never got involved in this question of demonstrating and voicing their opinions. Suddenly they started to do that because this was an anathema. It was contrary to everything that many of these first or second generation immigrants came to America for. You came to
Mm.
America because you thought that you would have a better, freer life, able to express yourself. You didn't have to suffer through the Cultural Revolution again and force your children to undergo that again. There are so many people from Russia that will say that this is a awful time in America when people were being canceled for their speech. You could not speak openly. And we had to gather in small groups at first where the parents started to speak and say, this is not right. We were really, truly just ordinary people for the first time thinking about what does this all mean in a
Mm.
society that no longer will respect us as individuals, but try to lump us together into categories, define you by that, punish you by that, reward you by that. That is very contrary to the exact things that most of the immigrants from around the world, even now, even today, come here to be able to have that kind of freedom. So that's how it all connects. We
Mm.
started with this education, but underlying it all is that you cannot have freedoms if you cannot have the freedom of speech.
Thank you for that. I definitely hear your story. Both Chris and I have a background of being New Yorkers. We actually met when we were students at New York University, and I part of my story was this is quite a long time ago now, but I actually used to be a tutor for the middle school students who were trying to apply to get into those specialized high schools. And maybe you can even tell some people more about these because these specialized high schools really were special in the best sense of the word. And what I remember and why I was so proud even to do that work was precisely because, as you pointed out, there really was just this test that you had to pass. And what it meant was that people from any background who came into, and this was New York City, so it's the hub of immigration, even historically. And there were so many powerful stories of all these students who had been immigrants, who had come from the most humble backgrounds, but were able to prove themselves through the objective academic measure of what this test was and get this pass key to an amazing education. And being able to go to one of those high schools was precisely what led them to be able to go to an elite college and then go off to an amazing career. And I know just it saddened me that one of the things that I've seen even in New York City, and as you're pointing out beyond, is that the value of free speech, it does no longer seem to be as appreciated, even as it were, say, a decade or so ago when I was doing some of this tutoring work. So I'd love to hear you say even more, just to let the audience know about really what was so special about these high schools from your perspective, and the value of this, and what you would say to the people nowadays who don't understand why free speech is so important for a flourishing society and a flourishing human life.
Well, I think that if you don't have the freedom of thought, freedom of speech actually is related to freedom of thought. You
Hmm.
cannot,
Yes.
if you cannot express yourself, that's basically saying don't even think it. Okay,
Yep.
and you cannot have a healthy engagement politically or even socially. Uh, Forget the politics. Look at your smaller sphere, your smaller community. If at every point you wanted to say something and you were walking on eggshells, that's really very bizarre. How do you have intellectual discourse? How do you have academic discourse? How can you just take the whatever is the party line? That's really coming out to be a party line issue where even some of the schools, you were talking about how things have changed so much in 10 years. That's exactly it. The schools have also changed very much. They have become a lot more ideological to suppress other kinds of thinking. And
Mm,
that's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to foster different ways of learning to know the facts, and then you express your opinions. To be very clear on the difference of what is fact and what is opinion.
mm,
If you say that there is my truth, you're not talking about truth any longer. You're talking about opinion. Stop saying my
mhm,
truth. You're
mm.
saying that's my opinion. That's my perspective. That is fair. You can have your perspective. Some people are taller. They see things from another angle. Some people are shorter. They see things from another angle. That's okay. That's perspective. But that has nothing to do with, oh, that's my truth of what the world looks like. It's not. And
No.
so we have an ideological bent that actually says that I am going to change what learning is, what speaking is, what thinking is. And that's not good. You cannot have the right kind of inquiry that is necessary for a proper discourse and also for progress in not just this country, but in the world. You have to have that kind of free exchange. So I would say that that's my first expression of why this is important and how you see it in the schools. Um, as for the no, Joya, you wanted me to address also.
I think you captured the essence of it. Basically, what made these schools special was exactly that they focused on. My takeaway from what you described. Let me know if I understood correctly. Is that because they were merit based, they were focused on objective knowledge and inspiring that, teaching people how to discover it. Whereas now, kind of the move away from meritocracy and objectivity, it seems to be corresponding with also a growing ideology, or uh, what's the word, growing ideology, or kind of issue agenda advocacy within the schools as well, rather than teaching critical thinking.
Well, that's exactly what I was saying about the my truth aspect, right?
Well, that's why I laugh. That's such a pet peeve of mine. Ever since that phrase came on the scene, it was uh, quite disturbing, even on a fundamental level, because I recognized from the outset that it was an attempt to kind of uh, smuggle in something other than a question of fact for one of value,
That's right.
and without drawing the distinction between the two for the average listener.
That's right. And I think that there's a lot of language that comes in to capture and hold truth bound so that it doesn't come out, and that's very very wrong. So I think that it does take in supporting free speech, we have to understand what the other free speech is, which is not really free. So it's a kind of manipulation. It's a distortion of words. It's taking words, capturing them, as I said, and then very often they beat up the words so that they say precisely the opposite from what they were originally intended. So I think that that's something that one should understand. I mean, it happened in Soviet Russia, it happened in communist China, it happened in Pol Pot, where they actually killed. What happens in language, unfortunately, sometimes translates further if you do not have that kind of tolerance. In Cambodia, they had a population of 7 million and killed two of them. That is devastating for any country, but that was ideological. That was for control. That was stopping free speech. It was, and once you stop free speech and free thought, you will also stop free action. So they
Mm-hmm.
all come together.
Yeah.
Um, I should add on the specialized high schools, they started off as being STEM schools, okay, and they still are STEM schools. They are supposedly for science, technology, engineering, math, and that actually, in its ideal, is going to be focused on objectivity. This is not
Mm-hmm.
to say that the other pursuits in the arts are not high and important. But as far as these schools are concerned, there are currently 8 specialized high schools. Only one of them is not STEM specific.
Mm.
And so to have an academic test to judge merit on that, that is so basic. If you cannot do your basic fractions, don't really talk to me about trying to say, I can, uh, I am entitled to be in a school, a STEM school, even though can't do fractions. That
Mm-hmm.
boggles the mind. But that becomes ideological as opposed to something that is logical. That's another
Right.
thing about free speech. We should be able to have a conversation and pursue the logic and inquiry and try to reason. If you say that we're not going to have free speech, well, on the basis of that, that's highly unreasonable. So
Yeah.
there we are on
Well,
that.
well, and to tie it together, I mean, I think what you're describing is exactly why you need objective standards and need this distinction between fact and value, so that people, um, you know, can focus on what's logical versus what is, either an opinion or an agenda or anything else, and also, um, you know, as advocates of reason and science, which is the foundation of human progress, you also need that objective fact-based framework. And so, as you noted, there's a reason why 15 plus Nobel Prize winners have come out of these schools. But to the extent that those standards start to drift or be moved away, then obviously it's going to be likely that there will be less progress coming out of that as well.
Absolutely. The more ideology infringes on academics, the less true thinking, truth seeking, expansion and extension of the boundaries of intellectual life there will be. And that's where we will lag behind. Uh, I was just in a meeting yesterday, actually, where several professors were decrying what's happened in American education. You don't have enough students who can do the math because math is now considered to be suspect. And there will be other terms that have been thrown at it that math is racist. Now,
Mm.
there's nothing racist in math. Math is the language of science, in fact. But if you do not produce enough students because they're all being ideologically taught, and even in their math classes to be ideologically taught,
Wow.
yes, you could see some of the lesson plans. It's amazing when they start putting in ideology and simple math, and we could go spend another hour on that. But when you have something like that happening, you find that a lot of the fields where you need mathematicians in your graduate schools, you are not getting your native born Americans. They are foreign students. A huge majority of them will be foreign students. And so we have to ask ourselves here, as a nation, what do we want in this country? Do we want to just be in the realm of not allowing for free speech and talking about my truths, as opposed to universal truths, which is what science tries to find? Okay?
Mm-hmm.
What our academies should be trying to look for is not a one sided position, but to, and we have a real problem right now. If you look at the universities, they talk about diversity, but where's the diversity of thought?
Mm-hmm.
Universities are supposed to be diversity of thought. They are not supposed to be diversity of the most superficial of skin colors. We should be talking about diversity of thought, and we don't have that. We clearly don't have that. I am not going to say that one should be of one party or another, or that it should be in some ways absolutely reflective of even the general population, because universities are not about being a reflection of the population. It is not, because if we were to reflect the population, we're going to have a lot of the people who don't even want to be in a university, right? By
Right.
definition, there are people who
Yeah.
are not meant to be students in a university and to be absolutely representative actually, it's not, this whole representation notion should be thrown out the window, but let's call it proportional. If people are proportional, you're going to find that there are people who don't belong there. Kids who should have been in some sort of vocational setting, and you're telling them that the fishermen should be also part of your university. That doesn't make sense. So we should throw those things out. But certainly, on what is important in a university is that diversity of thought, and we don't have it. And we don't have it if we think about it that it's probably maybe less than one less than 10% of your students in your top universities will identify themselves as anything other than a more left or progressive or bent. Now, that should alarm us because we have to be able to think from the multiple angles and not be so much groupthink. When you have all groupthink, that's when you nearly always will fail. You're going to lose a lot of good things there.
I absolutely agree with you. And I'll share one of the things that I definitely see is that the people who would agree with your perspective often now in these settings feel afraid to speak out on these exact topics. So we only have time for one more question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about what we can do to inspire those who are in these situations where there is definite, admittedly, there's risk to speaking out. What would you say to help people find the inspiration and the courage to let their voice be heard?
Well, the first thing is that courage comes in many different forms. Courage comes in speaking up. Courage comes from supporting those who speak up. Courage is also contagious. So if you do speak up and you stand up, I'll tell you, when we first began this, trying to fight for our specialized high schools, just the same thing out in the other parts of the country, it all began with just small groups of people. It was not a large number, but you have to talk to one another, express yourselves, uh, understand that there is a certain amount of risk, but that there are also people here to support our basic principles that this country is still built on the ability for people to come from different backgrounds and express themselves. This is the notion of what's built this country, made it great. E pluribus unum, from many, many, one. And it has to be diverse. It's not like everybody's going to be cookie cutter or forced into a mode. So think about it that way, that you are here to be able to express, not to express in an oppressive manner, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
we should be able to have civil discourse. And when people are not being civil, you just say that, call it out. That's not civil. Now let's get back to business and listen to what everyone has to say. And it's got to be reasonable, and don't try what is not reasonable. So that's what we have to do. Encourage more people to do exactly what we're doing over here. Having an
Mm-hmm.
exchange of ideas, asking questions, answering questions, exploring what are some of the issues and how we address them.
Wonderfully said. Thank you for that. I certainly find that inspiring and hope our listeners do too. Hopefully, more of the young people, particularly that you guys advocate for, whether New York City or elsewhere, as they're coming of age and confronting some of these challenges, will hear that message too, because it obviously is not only the parents advocating on their behalf, but also the students themselves who need to stand up and speak out. And there's no age too early to start finding that voice and practicing that courage. So thank you, Wai Wah, for your time. That actually completes our time. And as always, for our listeners out there, you can find our next episode releasing every other week on Tuesdays under ILV's Dissidents podcast page, either on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever most podcasts stream, or the video on YouTube and our website, 1776forward.com. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much.